Thank you for staying with us. You're watching SA Today on SABC News with me, Flolet Wabak. Vote counting is underway in Chad. Following an election yesterday, the outcome is expected to be the same as usual. President Idriss Deby winning another term. This would be his sixth term. But the backdrop has been rather tense. Several major opposition figures boycotted the poll. Meanwhile, vote counting is also underway in Benin after a presidential poll yesterday that was boycotted by some opposition parties over pre-election violence and their objection to President Patrice Talon's request for a second term. To discuss more on these elections, we're now joined by political analyst Dr. Charles Sinkala. Dr. Sinkala, it's always a pleasure to see you. Thank you for joining us here on SABC News.
Thank you very much for having me. I do appreciate it.
So, we're looking at what's happening in Chad and Benin, and it's difficult for one, as the news comes in, to see these elections as having had any sort of fairness, attached to them. We look at Chad, where we're seeing President Deby wanting to extend a 30-year rule, which is not something new on our continent. In Benin, opposition groups boycotting elections, some saying that they were in fact sidelined and then they boycotted. What is your analysis of what's happening really in both countries?
I think, thank you very much. I think the culture of working together as people on the continent has been lost, because if you see the case of Chad and Benin, they are similar to other cases that we've seen elsewhere in the elections on the African continent. And it gives us a sense that people, specifically the politicians, they are failing to work together. And this is very bad to the development of the economies in the African region and the bloc. And, we're so disappointed that the United Nations, the AU and the regional bloc have failed to define the elections and to mitigate the risk caused by the hosting of the elections.
Yeah. Dr. Sinkala, it seems that, we continue to see this happening on the African continent, but we kind of just move on from it. I mean, if you're looking at the situation in Chad, where the presidential votes have been marred by boycott, assassination, and in fact, some reports are saying that there were even bomb plots. The fact that, in a couple of days, it will be all systems go, and congratulations to the administration that wins, and most likely, of course, President Deby. Are we, we're certainly not doing enough to stop this from happening, but why does it sort of tend to continue to happen? Because I suppose there's no repercussions, but what are the other factors that contribute to these situations continuing in Africa?
I think it's a failure to leadership. When leaders fail to solve a problem, leadership becomes a problem, and the transfer of the problem goes to the leadership themselves, because we know already what we need in Africa, that we need to govern ourselves and work together. But I think all this and all the past presidents, or the spirits of the people who've been trying to work Africa together, has been failing because of a divide and the lack of working together. And I think also, our constitutions are changed to suit ourselves. If you look at the story in Chad, the constitution was changed in 2018, to allow him to vote for another, to extend his 30-year term. Now he's talking of staying in power up to 2033. That aggravates the other people who want to participate in the so-called democracy. So this gives a very bad impression to the promotion of democracy, especially on the continent, that we strive as people and as Africans to work together to make sure that we enjoy the development of our continent, so that when we no more on earth, we should be able to point at something that we did this. But if you look at the presidential terms, they are not specifically kept like the KPIs in the corporate world, where performance has to be valued between that period you are entrusted as president of the country. They believe that they are the messiahs and they need to preside over the countries. Look what has happened also just recently in Uganda, and how the young people have been deprived, by the so-called old guards who still wants to cling into the power. and that has yielded no results. And as well, we must also look at the interference from the outside world, which has contributed to the fights and the civil wars we are experiencing in the countries. Look at Mozambique. Also, it is also another problem that we are failing to protect and keep the peace and security to our citizens. So if we do not have that guidance, to condemn the extensions of presidential office, to those who want just to sit in the office, as ceremony presidential candidates, rather than developing and making sure that we as leaders on the continent, we are not producing stateless citizens, but we are developing our continent.
Yeah. Doctor, let's then zoom in on Benin. The fact that the opposition parties boycotted these elections. What are the rules in the country? What now then happens in a case where I would assume there would have to be an official opposition, but if all the opposition parties boycotted the elections, I mean, what then happens from this point? Is there any sort of repercussions? Is there anything that happens at this point? What will then now take place, given the fact that they've decided they're not taking part in those elections, because then it's not a fair election?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there is no repercussion from them. There's no organization of body, even the Electoral Commission, who hold them accountable for not going to vote. Remember, voting is a constitutional right performed by a citizen, and it is not enforced that people have to vote, or whether or not they have to vote. But boycotting elections on the continent has only exacerbated the violence in the country. That will go on because the one who stay in power will have that advantage to continue, to abuse the nation and the people's democracy. And, he would be declared a leader, for instance, in the case of Benin, and, the violence will just escalate because now the opposition, after not contesting the elections, which is supposed to be a process of democracy, they will make now the system of government to be ungovernable by the incumbent president, to make sure that they do not work together, to make sure that they incite some riots within the country and protests and, all sorts of things, just to make sure that his term in office is uncomfortable, as to go back to what happened when he took office.
All right, Dr. Sinkala, let's leave it there. Thank you very much for giving us your time, as always. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
All right, so that is the discussion then with Dr. Charles Sinkala, political analyst on the elections in Chad as well as Benin, both with some issues there in relation to fairness of the elections, with Chad having boycotts, bomb plots, assassinations allegedly, as well as Benin having opposition groups boycotting those elections as they were indeed sidelined. We'll certainly keep you updated as to what is happening in both those countries as soon as we do have more information.